Hello, welcome to 8 bits. This is part 4, differences between Oracle database and Microsoft SQL Server database. In this session we will see the differences between Oracle and SQL Server, primary key and default constraint creation. So we will create primary key and default constraint in both the databases. So let's jump to SQL Server. In our previous video we have created a table department in HRDB database. Let's expand HRDB database and we will go to department table. I will click on design the table structure. So here you can see there is no primary key for department ID column. So we will create a department ID primary key using the scripts. We are creating primary key constraint for a department table which is already exist. So to create this primary key we have to alter the table. The syntax is alter table, table name, add constraint, then constraint name, primary key, then column name. So here the query will be alter table department, add constraint, pk department id. This is the name of this primary key constraint. Then primary key, then I will open a bracket and then I will mention the column name called department id. So once I execute this query, department id primary key, here we receive an error, cannot define primary key constraint on nullable column. We are receiving this error because when we created a new table department, for a column department id we have kept to allow null values. As we know, primary key, the strict rule is there should not be allow any null values. Now we need to alter the table again and make our column department id not to allow null values. Then only the primary key will be accepted for this table. Now make the changes. We have to write a query alter table department alter column department id varchar of 12 not null. So in this statement we are making the changes in department table for the column department id not allow any null values. Now this script is executed and affected to the table and the column became not null. Now let's execute the primary key script. Yes, this is also executed. Now let's go to the table design structure and let's see whether the primary key is already affected to the table or not. Yes, the primary key, the key icon you can see in the department id column. Let us test the primary key with inserting two same values to the table department. I have added 101 as department id with the two rows and I am trying to insert both the rows. So first row is inserted. While inserting the second row I am getting a primary key constraint error, cannot insert duplicate key value to the table department. Now let us create a default constraint on our department table on status column. You can see here when I inserted a row I have added 1 as status. So 1 means active. Now by default if I am not passing 1, then by default it has to go 0. So we can write this using a default constraint. So the query command is alter table department add constraint, then constraint name, that is I am writing df status, that is default status, then the default what exactly the value is. So default is 0 for status column. Once this statement I am executing, the table will be got altered, and whenever if I am passing the value null, then the null will be inserted to that column. So I have added null in our second row insert statement. Then I have executed this. Now let's see select star from department. Here you can see the status null, the data is added in status column. And whenever if we are not passing any value for status, by default table constraint will automatically add default value as 0 for that row. Look at this third insert statement. Here I have excluded the status column itself and I am not passing any value, but by this default status value inserted as 0. This is because of default constraint. Now let's try this both primary key and default constraint in our Oracle database. In Oracle database we have already created department table in our last session. So now I have copied entire my scripts from Microsoft SQL Server and I have pasted here in Oracle database. Now when I am running this statement, the same statement, alter table name, I'm getting error because Oracle doesn't support the square brackets for the column name. So I have removed now for the department ID the square brackets and the primary key is created. Here I have executed another time, that's why it is saying primary key is already exist. Kindly remove the extra primary key. So I'm adding the primary key for the same column again, that's why I'm getting this error. Let us test this primary key. I'm executing insert statement for department and I'm getting here error because I have copied the same script from my SQL server. So here get date. Here get date keyword is not exist. Instead of that we have to add sysdate. When I'm executing this row, one row is inserted. I will add the second row using the department ID same. Here one thing we have to remember that once we execute any script like update, insert, delete, we have to commit. So let me execute the second query, the department ID as same as 101 which I have inserted earlier. I am getting an error called the constraint violation. That means 101 is already there in the system right now and we are trying to insert again 101, that's why we are getting that. Let me change that 102 and execute the query. So the second row is inserted here and I will commit that row. When we run the select statement, we can see both the rows. Now we will try to create a default constraint same as for the column status and let us check how exactly it works in Oracle. So the same statement I have executed here and I am getting an error called table department add constraint to db status for having error, that is invalid identifier. That means here the statement is different. So let's see what exactly the changes required. The default constraint we have to mention using a script alter table department, then we have to write a modify statement, modify, then the column name, that is status. First let us see what exactly the status data type is. So I will write a command description table name, the type of status data type is number of 1. So here I will mention status default 1. That means if I am not passing any value for column status, then by default it will insert as 1. So now this alter statement is executed and I have committed to my database is committed. Now let us try to insert our statement, the third statement. So the third statement is executed and if I run the select query, you can see here by default the third row status default to value 1 has been set. That is because we have altered the table
and modify the status column name. So the main differences between the Microsoft SQL Server and Oracle, while creating primary key, in Oracle it doesn't allow the square brackets for the column name, and for altering the table and for setting the default constraint we have to write a separate statement by modifying the column name.
We have tried primary key and default constraint examples in both the databases. Now let's understand what exactly primary key constraint and default constraint definition is. The primary key constraint uniquely identifies each record in the table. Each record should be unique. It is not allowing any null values. The primary key in one table, only one primary key will be available, and this primary key will be for one column or multiple columns, but there should be only one primary key. The default constraint is used to set a default value for a column. The value is not passed, then the default value will be inserted. So that's it in this video. Thank you for watching this video, and in the next session we will see foreign key and other related details.